The letter from the Homeowners Association was taped to Marcus Wright's front door, its official letterhead gleaming in the morning sun like a fresh wound. Diane Levinson, HOA board president, had signed it with a flourish that took up half the page. Marcus ripped it off and scanned the contents, his coffee going cold in his hand. Immediate remediation required, the letter demanded. Unauthorized landscaping modifications, violation of Section 7.3, potential fines of $100 per day. 3 houses down, Diane Levinson watched through her pristine bay window, binoculars resting on the windowsill. At 57, she had perfected the art of surveillance. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her thin lips curled into a satisfied smile as she observed Marcus crumpling the notice. "That's number 3 this week," she murmured to herself, making a precise checkmark in her leather-bound notebook. Order must be maintained. Diane had been running the Whispering Pines HOA with an iron fist for 7 years. Her husband, Gerald, a quiet man who had long ago learned to fade into the background of their marriage, nodded absently from behind his newspaper. He didn't need to see what she was doing. The rhythm of their mornings had been identical for nearly 2 decades. "The Wright property is destroying our neighborhood's aesthetic harmony," Diane continued, not caring if Gerald was listening. "Those native plants he calls water-conserving landscaping are nothing but weeds. The board meeting tonight will address it once and for all." What Diane didn't know, as she carefully documented Marcus's reaction, was that her newest target was not like the others who had wilted under her regulatory assault. Marcus Wright, a hydrologist who had moved to Whispering Pines 6 months ago, had dealt with bureaucracies far more formidable than a suburban HOA. That evening, Diane presided over the HOA meeting in the community center, 13 residents in attendance, barely enough for quorum. Marcus slipped in quietly, taking his seat in the back row. Diane's eyes narrowed when she spotted him. "Item number 4 on the agenda," she announced, her voice carrying an authority cultivated through years of committee meetings and neighborhood disputes. "Property violations at 227 Sycamore Lane." Marcus leaned forward as Diane pulled up a PowerPoint slide showing his front yard, complete with date-stamped photos taken from various angles. "As you can see," Diane continued, laser pointer dancing over the images, "the drought-resistant garden installed without board approval violates our community standards for uniform landscaping. The plants exceed the maximum height restriction, and several species are not on our approved vegetation list." The board members nodded in synchronized agreement. They had learned long ago that disagreeing with Diane only prolonged meetings. "Additionally," Diane said, her voice rising slightly, "we have reason to believe these modifications may be affecting the underground water flow to neighboring properties. Mrs. Henderson next door has reported a decrease in her well's water pressure since these changes were made." That was when Marcus Wright stood up. He hadn't planned to speak tonight, merely to observe how Diane operated. But now his professional integrity was being questioned. "Excuse me," he said, his calm voice cutting through the room. "I'd like to address these accusations." Diane's eyes flashed with something between irritation and delight. She lived for confrontation, especially with rule breakers. What she didn't realize was that she had just declared war on the wrong person. A man who not only understood water rights better than anyone in the county, but who also happened to be the new owner of the mountain spring that fed every well in Whispering Pines. Diane's perfectly manicured fingernails gripped the podium as she stared down at Marcus. His unexpected challenge had disrupted her carefully orchestrated meeting. "The floor recognizes Marcus Wright," she said, her voice clipped with false politeness. "You have 2 minutes." Marcus nodded, staying in place rather than approaching the front. "Thank you, Mrs. Levinson. First, my landscaping changes comply with the county's new water conservation ordinance, which supersedes HOA regulations. Second, as a hydrologist with 15 years of field experience, I can assure everyone that native plants with deeper root systems actually improve groundwater retention, not diminish it." He paused, letting his credentials sink in. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "And third," Marcus continued, "Mrs. Henderson's well pressure issues began 3 months before I moved in, according to county records. I'd be happy to help diagnose the actual problem, free of charge." A murmur rippled through the room. Diane's face flushed as she rapped her gavel sharply. "The board appreciates your opinion, Mr. Wright. However, our covenants clearly state—" "I've reviewed the covenants thoroughly," Marcus interrupted, pulling out a marked-up copy from his messenger bag. "Section 12.7 specifically allows for environmentally beneficial modifications when they serve the greater community interest. I'd be happy to explain how my xeriscaping does exactly that." Diane's jaw tightened. No one interrupted her, ever. "This meeting has a set agenda," she said icily. "If you wish to formally appeal the violation, there's a procedure for that. Forms are available on our website." Marcus smiled. "I've already submitted the appeal. 3 weeks ago, actually. The bylaws require a response within 14 days. Across the room, HOA Secretary Jim Peterson suddenly became very interested in his shoelaces. He had buried Marcus' appeal under a stack of paperwork at Diane's request. "We'll address that separately," Diane managed. Moving on to item 5. "One more thing," Marcus said. "Given Mrs. Henderson's well concerns, I took the liberty of testing water samples from various properties. The results were interesting." The room went completely silent. Diane's face had gone from flushed to pale. "What kind of tests?" asked Ronald Cooper from the second row, a retired chemist whose opinions carried weight in the community. "Standard quality and mineral composition analysis," Marcus replied, "which revealed concerning levels of chemical runoff in properties along Pine Creek Road, particularly numbers 431 through 437. Diane lived at 435 Pine Creek Road." "That's absurd," Diane snapped. "My lawn service uses only approved products." "Interesting you should mention your lawn," Marcus said. "The nitrogen levels suggest over-application of fertilizer at a rate roughly 4 times the recommended amount. The runoff is affecting the aquifer that feeds many of our wells." Board member Ellen Michaels raised her hand hesitantly. "Is that dangerous?" "Not immediately," Marcus replied, "but over time it can contaminate drinking water. I prepared information packets on proper fertilizer application for anyone interested." He pulled out a stack of professionally printed brochures. Several residents reached for them. Diane slammed her gavel repeatedly. "This is completely off topic. Mr. Wright, you're out of order." But it was too late. The meeting had slipped from her control. As residents clustered around Marcus, Diane retreated to the side table where Gerald waited, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resignation. "Who does he think he is?" she hissed. "Moving in here and disrupting our community standards." Gerald sighed. "Maybe he has a point about the fertilizer, Diane. Remember what happened to the Johnson's dog after drinking from our bird bath?" Diane shot him a withering look. "That was completely unrelated. I'm not about to let some newcomer dictate how I maintain my property." What neither of them realized was that Marcus had overheard every word and was already formulating his next move in a chess game Diane didn't yet know they were playing. The following morning, Diane rose at precisely 5:45 a.m., just as she had every day for the past decade. But today, her routine was disturbed by the memory of last night's humiliation. Marcus Wright had challenged her authority in front of the entire board, and worse, people had listened to him. After her second cup of coffee, Diane picked up her phone and dialed a number she rarely used but kept on speed dial for special situations. "Calvin, it's Diane Levinson. I need a favor." She paused, listening. "Yes, I know it's early. This is important. I need everything you can find on a Marcus Wright. He's new to Whispering Pines, claims to be a hydrologist." Calvin Durman was a paralegal at her cousin's law firm and had access to databases most people didn't know existed. If there was dirt to be found on Marcus Wright, Calvin would unearth it. 3 hours later, Diane's printer hummed as pages of information on her newest adversary emerged. She scanned the documents with growing frustration. Marcus Wright was distressingly legitimate, degrees from respected universities, publications in scientific journals, and a spotless professional record. But everyone had secrets. Diane just needed to dig deeper. Meanwhile, across the neighborhood, Marcus was meeting with Barbara Henderson, Diane's next-door neighbor and supposed victim of his landscaping changes. "I really appreciate you looking at this," Barbara said, leading Marcus to her backyard well pump. "The pressure's been terrible since January." "Happy to help," Marcus replied, kneeling to examine the equipment. "Mrs. Levinson mentioned at the meeting that you'd complained about my landscaping affecting your water." Barbara's brow furrowed. "What? I never said anything about your yard. I mentioned my well problems to Diane once ago before you even moved in." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "That's what I thought. Mind if I check a few things?" After 30 minutes of investigation, Marcus identified the issue, a failing pressure switch combined with mineral buildup in the pipes. He explained the problem to Barbara, who sighed with relief at the simple diagnosis. "I can recommend a good plumber," he offered, "or if you're comfortable with DIY repairs, the parts would only cost about $40. "That's it?" Barbara asked incredulously. The last specialist wanted to drill a deeper well for thousands. As Marcus wrote down instructions and part numbers, Barbara's phone chimed with a neighborhood alert. Her eyes widened as she read the screen. "Oh my, Diane's called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow night about water contamination risks," and she looked up at Marcus' property values being threatened by rogue landscaping. Marcus' expression remained neutral, but inside he was smiling. Diane was playing right into his hands. That evening, Diane marched purposefully around the cul-de-sac, clipboard in hand, knocking on doors. By nightfall, she had secured commitments from 17 homeowners to attend tomorrow's meeting. "Marcus Wright won't know what hit him," she told Gerald over dinner. I've documented every violation at his property, cross-referenced with our covenants. I prepared a slideshow of compliant yards versus his eyesore. And I found 3 neighborhood associations he belonged to previously, all of which had documented disputes with him. Gerald looked up from his salmon. 3 different HOAs had problems with him. That seems odd for a professional. People like him move from neighborhood to neighborhood causing trouble, Diane said, stabbing a piece of asparagus. Environmental crusaders who think rules don't apply to them. Gerald chewed thoughtfully. Did you actually verify those complaints? Diane waved dismissively. Calvin's sending the details tomorrow, but the pattern is clear. What Diane didn't know was that Marcus had indeed been involved with 3 previous HOAs as a consultant hired to resolve water management issues. In each case, he had helped implement changes that saved the communities thousands in water costs. Changes that had been resisted initially by board members very much like Diane Levinson. As darkness fell over Whispering Pines, both Diane and Marcus prepared for battle, but only one of them knew the true stakes of the war, and it wasn't Diane. The community center buzzed with anticipation as residents filed in for the emergency meeting. Diane had arrived 45 minutes early to arrange the chairs in theater-style rows rather than the usual circle, a subtle power move that put her at the front, elevated and in control. Her PowerPoint presentation was loaded and ready, 23 meticulously crafted slides documenting Marcus' rights violations, the alleged water issues, and the dire consequences for property values if left unchecked. Calvin had come through with additional information, not exactly what she hoped for, but she'd massaged the data to suit her narrative. Quite the turnout, Gerald murmured as he surveyed the growing crowd. 32 residents had already arrived, more than had attended any meeting in years. People care about their investments, Diane replied, straightening her blazer. Once they understand the threat, they'll back the board's decision to take stronger action. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Diane called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began, her voice carrying the perfect blend of authority and concern. We're facing an unprecedented situation that requires immediate community attention. She clicked to her first slide, a split-screen image contrasting a manicured lawn with Marcus's native plant garden. Several people nodded their disapproval at the comparison. As you can see, the approved standards for Whispering Pines provide a cohesive aesthetic that maintains our property values, Diane continued. The recent modifications at 227 Sycamore not only violate our covenants but may pose environmental risks as well. For 15 uninterrupted minutes, Diane built her case against Marcus, citing obscure bylaw sections, showing carefully angled photographs, and referring to expert opinions on water management that were, in fact, quotes from lawn care blogs. Furthermore, she said, approaching her key revelation, Mr. Wright has a history of disputes with homeowners associations. In fact, he's been involved with 3 separate HOAs in the past 5 years, all of which reported similar issues. A murmur rippled through the audience. Diane suppressed a smile. Just then, the door opened and Marcus entered, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came Barbara Henderson, followed by Ronald Cooper, the retired chemist, and most surprisingly, Jim Peterson, the HOA secretary who had buried Marcus's appeal paperwork. Sorry we're late, Marcus said pleasantly. We were finishing up some important water quality testing. Diane's smile tightened. Mr. Wright, we're in the middle of a presentation, if you kindly take a seat. Actually, Barbara Henderson interrupted, stepping forward, we have relevant information that the community should hear before voting on anything. This isn't on the agenda, Diane said, her knuckles whitening around her laser pointer. Jim Peterson cleared his throat. As board secretary, I move to amend tonight's agenda to include a brief presentation from these residents regarding water quality concerns. Ronald Cooper seconded the motion immediately. Trapped by her own procedural rules, Diane had no choice but to call a vote. To her dismay, the motion passed overwhelmingly. Marcus connected his laptop to the projector while Barbara addressed the crowd. Many of you know I've had well problems for months. Diane suggested it was because of Marcus's yard. But today, Marcus fixed my well in 30 minutes. A simple pressure switch that had nothing to do with his landscaping. Ronald Cooper stepped forward next. I've reviewed the water tests from 6 properties in our neighborhood, he said, his scientific credentials lending weight to every word. The results are consistent with Marcus's findings. Properties along Pine Creek Road show concerning chemical levels, while areas near native planting show improved water quality. As Ronald spoke, Jim Peterson quietly distributed a different packet to each resident, Marcus' original appeal, complete with detailed environmental impact assessments and a letter from the County Water Authority supporting his landscape choices. Diane watched in growing horror as her carefully constructed narrative collapsed. But worse was yet to come as Marcus finally took the floor, bringing up a document that made her blood run cold, the deed to Whispering Pines Mountain Spring. This, Marcus said as the document appeared on screen, is the deed to Whispering Pines Mountain Spring, which I purchased 3 months ago from Westland Development Corporation. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Everyone in Whispering Pines knew that their well water came from the mountain spring, but few had given much thought to who owned it. Westland was planning to sell the spring rights to Boulder Creek Bottling Company, Marcus continued. As a hydrologist, I recognize what that would mean for this community: depleted groundwater, failing wells, and eventually, the need to connect to municipal water at a cost of roughly $40,000 per household. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Diane stood frozen, her presentation forgotten. When I learned the spring was for sale, I leveraged my retirement savings to purchase it, Marcus explained. Not for profit, but to protect it. I then established a conservation easement that permanently preserves it as a natural water source for the existing community. Ellen Michaels raised her hand. So you own our water? Technically, yes, Marcus acknowledged. But the easement means I can't restrict your access or sell it for commercial use. It's protected in perpetuity. Then why are you telling us this now? Someone called from the back. Marcus clicked to the next slide. Chemical analysis report with one property highlighted in alarming red. Because the spring is at risk from chemical contamination. This analysis shows fertilizer and herbicide runoff flowing directly into the aquifer from a property on Pine Creek Road. All eyes turned to Diane, whose address was clearly visible on the report. That's an invasion of privacy, Diane sputtered. You took water samples from my property without permission. Actually, Ronald Cooper interjected, these samples were taken from the creek bed on public land. The chemical signature matches the specific brand of fertilizer visible in your garage during the community yard sale last month, the industrial-grade product that's restricted for commercial use only. Diane's face flushed crimson. How I maintain my lawn is my business. Not when it poisons our shared water supply, Barbara Henderson said firmly. My grandchildren swim in the creek that runs behind our properties. Jim Peterson stood up, adjusting his glasses nervously. I think we need to vote on a new measure. I propose that all properties within the Whispering Pines HOA be required to comply with county water protection guidelines, including the use of only approved residential lawn products. The motion was seconded instantly by 3 different residents. This is ridiculous, Diane protested. You can't just change the rules based on unverified allegations. Marcus calmly displayed another document. These are the results from an independent lab certified by the state environmental agency. They've issued a preliminary warning to the address in question. Gerald Levinson, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up from his seat in the second row. Diane, he said quietly, this isn't just about grass anymore. It's about her neighbor's health. The betrayal in Diane's eyes as she stared at her husband silenced the room. For 7 years, Gerald had never once contradicted her in public. I move we vote now, said Ronald Cooper, breaking the uncomfortable silence. As hands rose around the room, nearly unanimously in favor of the new water protection measure, Diane Levinson realized that something fundamental had shifted in Whispering Pines. Her carefully constructed kingdom was crumbling beneath her feet, and for once she had no procedural maneuver to stop it. The humiliation of that night's vote lingered with Diane like a persistent fever. For 3 days, she barely left the house, ignoring the sympathetic texts from the 2 board members who remained loyal to her. Even her usual morning surveillance routine fell by the wayside as she plotted her comeback. On the 4th day, Gerald found her at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts of county regulations, property law documents, and HOA bylaws. Diane, he said gently, maybe it's time to let this go. She looked up, dark circles under her eyes. Let it go. That man made me look like a criminal in front of our entire neighborhood. He presented facts, Gerald replied, pouring himself coffee. Facts we can't dispute. There's always a loophole, Diane muttered, returning to her papers. Always a way to fight back. Later that afternoon, Diane's doorbell rang. She opened it to find Barbara Henderson standing on her porch, holding a ceramic pot with a small plant. What do you want? Diane asked coldly. Barbara shifted uncomfortably. Marcus is helping several of us convert parts of our yards to native plants. I thought you might want one to start with. It's called yarrow, drought-resistant, and helps purify soil. Diane stared at the plant as if it might bite her. So you're all following him now? The garden guru who swooped in to save you from the evil HOA president? It's not like that, Barbara sighed. Look, I've lived next to you for 6 years. We've never been close, but we've been civil. The water issue affects all of us. Why not work with Marcus instead of against him? Because he deliberately undermined my authority, Diane snapped. He bought our water supply without disclosing it to the community. How is that not manipulation? He bought it to protect it, Barbara countered. The bottling company would have drained the aquifer dry. Diane's expression hardened. You don't actually know his intentions. None of you do. She shut the door without taking the plant, leaving Barbara standing bewildered on the porch. What Diane didn't share was what she discovered buried in county archives that morning, a zoning application filed by Marcus Wright for educational facilities on the Spring property. In her mind, this was the smoking gun that proved his true agenda, turning their peaceful neighborhood into some kind of environmental showcase with increased traffic, visitors, and disruption. The next morning, Diane drove to the county zoning office and filed a formal objection to Marcus' application, citing potential noise, traffic concerns, and impact on residential character. It was a long shot, but it felt good to take action. As she left the government building, she spotted Marcus in the parking lot, talking with a woman in a Parks Department jacket. Diane ducked behind a column, straining to hear their conversation. The educational signage should be installed next month, the woman was saying. The walking path will remain minimal, just enough for school groups to access the observation point without disturbing the habitat. Perfect, Marcus replied. The less disruption to the natural flow, the better. And remember, local residents always have priority access. Diane's eyes narrowed. School groups, observation points, this confirmed her worst fears. That evening, she drafted an email to every Whispering Pines resident. Urgent community alert. Recently, we voted on water protection measures based on Mr. Wright's presentations. What wasn't disclosed was his plan to develop the Spring property into a public environmental education site, bringing school buses, tourists, and constant foot traffic through our peaceful neighborhood. Emergency meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m. to discuss immediate action to protect our community's residential character and property values. As she hit send, Diane felt the familiar rush of righteousness. Marcus Wright might own their water, but she still knew how to mobilize their neighbors better than anyone. The battle for Whispering Pines was far from over. Diane arrived at the community center an hour early, arranging chairs and testing her presentation 3 times. Her hands trembled slightly, a new development she blamed on too much coffee. Today had to go perfectly. Her reputation, her position, her entire carefully constructed social order depended on it. As residents filed in, Diane noted with satisfaction that attendance was even higher than the previous meeting. Her email had worked. People cared about outsiders invading their neighborhood, even if they'd temporarily fallen under Marcus Wright's spell. At 7:05, with no sign of Marcus yet, Diane called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. I've discovered information that every homeowner needs to know before it's too late to act. She launched into her presentation, displaying county documents with key phrases highlighted: educational facility, public access, school programs. As you can see, Diane continued, Mr. Wright has applied for permits to transform the Spring property into what amounts to a public park. Buses of school children, environmental tourists, researchers, all with access to trails that border our private backyards. Murmurs of concern spread through the audience. Even those who had supported Marcus looked troubled. Property values in your public facilities typically decrease by 15 to 20%, Diane added, displaying a chart she created that morning. And that's not counting the noise, traffic, and privacy concerns. Ellen Michaels raised her hand. Has the county approved this already? The application is pending, Diane replied. I've filed an objection on behalf of the HOA, but we need a united community response to have the best chance of stopping this. Just then, the door opened and Marcus entered. Unlike previous meetings, he came alone. He took a seat in the back row without interrupting. Mr. Wright, Diane acknowledged him with cold politeness. Perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone why you concealed your development plans when asking us to support your water protection measures. Marcus stood but remained by his seat. I haven't concealed anything, Mrs. Levinson, but I see you've drawn some dramatic conclusions from partial information. These are your permit applications, Diane countered, gesturing to the screen. Yes, Marcus nodded. For a small observation deck and educational signage about water's protection. Not exactly Disneyland. He walked to the front and connected his phone to the projector. May I? Before Diane could object, he displayed the complete plans. A modest wooden platform overlooking the spring, several informational signs, and a narrow footpath. The facility is a single platform that can hold perhaps 15 people at once, Marcus explained. School visits would be limited to 4 per year by appointment only, and residents would have veto power over the schedule through a community oversight committee. He clicked to another document. This is the conservation easement I mentioned last time. Section 8.3 specifically prohibits commercial development and limits educational use to minimize impact on the residential community. Ronald Cooper studied the document. This actually looks quite restrictive, more protective than if a developer bought it, which is exactly what would have happened, Marcus pointed out. The alternative wasn't leave it untouched forever. It was sell to the highest bidder. Barbara Henderson stood up. I visited the Madison Creek Waters last year. They have a similar setup. You'd hardly know it was there, and the educational component has actually increased property values because of the protected green space. Diane watched in mounting horror as the tide turned against her yet again. Marcus hadn't built a theme park. He created a modest educational site with more restrictions than the county whip required. There's another element I'd like to discuss, Marcus continued, his voice gentler now. Mrs. Levinson, you presented this as a sneak attack on the community. But the truth is, I presented these exact plans at my first HOA meeting 3 months ago. It's in the minutes that Mr. Peterson distributed to all homeowners. All eyes turned to Diane. She frantically tried to recall that meeting, one she chaired herself. Had she been so dismissive of the new resident that she hadn't even registered what he was proposing?